Rose Fitzgerald was born in Boston in 1890 into a wealthy Irish Catholic family. Her father, John Francis "Honey" Fitzgerald, was a powerful political boss and future mayor of Boston. Despite their wealth, Fitzgeralds were entirely excluded from Boston's Protestant elite, the Boston Brahmins. Honey Fitz used his family to project an image of respectable Catholic domesticity to combat this exclusion. From a young age, Rose was placed on campaign stages. She was instructed to smile, wave, and suppress her personal feelings. She learned early that public perception was more important than private reality. Rose was highly intelligent and academically driven. Her primary ambition was to attend Wellesley College, a prestigious Protestant-affiliated school, to earn a bachelor's degree and prove her intellectual equality. She passed the entrance exams and was accepted. However, Boston's Catholic Archbishop, William O'Connell, publicly decreed that Catholic parents must not send their children to secular colleges. Because Honey Fitz relied on the Archbishop's support for his political survival, he banned Rose from attending Wellesley. Instead, he sent her to strict, isolated convent schools in Europe and New York. This decision stripped Rose of her autonomy. It taught her a harsh reality. Male authority figures held absolute control over her future, and they would sacrifice her ambitions for their own political convenience. She realized that to gain any control over her own life, she would need to manipulate power structures from the inside. This sense of powerlessness worsened during a family visit to the White House to meet President William McKinley. Rose prepared meticulously, expecting validation for her maturity and intellect. Instead, McKinley ignored her completely. He focused entirely on her younger sister Agnes, loudly praising her as the prettiest girl who ever entered the White House. For Rose, already stung by social exclusion in Boston, this public dismissal was a direct hit to her pride. She internalized the rejection. She resolved to build a life of such undeniable wealth and status that she could never be ignored again. She stopped seeking intellectual validation and began prioritizing power. This drive drew her to Joseph P. Kennedy. Joe was an ambitious Harvard graduate determined to make a fortune and force the Boston establishment to respect him. Crucially, his father, Patrick Kennedy, was Honey Fitz's bitterest political rival. For Joe, marrying Rose was a strategic victory. For Rose, Joe was an exit strategy. He was not intimidated by her father, and he offered a clear path to independence. When Honey Fitz discovered the courtship, he explicitly forbade it. He confined Rose to the house and eventually sent her on a long trip to Europe to break the attachment. His aggressive opposition only strengthened their resolve. Joe continued to court her, completely ignoring her father's threats. In October 1914, facing the threat of an elopement and a massive public scandal, Honey Fitz yielded. Rose and Joe married in a small, private ceremony overseen by Cardinal O'Connell. At 24 years old, Rose believed she had finally outsmarted her father and taken control of her life. In reality, she was entering a marriage that would soon subject her to severe public humiliation and emotional neglect. When Rose Fitzgerald married Joseph P. Kennedy in 1914, she believed she was stepping into a partnership of equals. She assumed they would conquer the Boston establishment together. Joe certainly conquered it. In the years following their wedding, his rise was meteoric and aggressive. He made millions on Wall Street, capitalized on the shifting economies of World War I, and eventually dominated the booming motion picture industry in Hollywood. He amassed a fortune that would eventually exceed $90 million. He gave Rose houses, staff, and unlimited credit accounts. He gave her everything except respect. The reality of the Kennedy marriage became apparent almost immediately. Joe was not a faithful husband. More importantly, he made no effort to hide his infidelity. For Joe, affairs were not mistakes or momentary lapses in judgment. They were extensions of his ego. He viewed women as conquests, much like the banks he bought or the stock shares he manipulated. For Rose, this was a specific type of psychological torture. She had been raised to project perfect Catholic morality. Her entire identity was tied up in being a respectable, flawless wife. Jo's blatant cheating made a mockery of the image she worked so hard to maintain. The infidelity was not confined to brief, hidden encounters. It was institutionalized within their marriage. Jo often brought his mistresses into their social circles. The most severe and public humiliation came in the late 1920s, when Jo moved his business operations to Hollywood to take over film studios. There, he began a highly publicized 3-year affair with Gloria Swanson, the most famous silent film star in the world at the time. Jo did not keep Swanson a secret. He paraded her across the country. He even brought her to the Kennedy family home to have dinner with Rose. Rose was forced to sit at the head of her own dining table, maintaining polite conversation, while her husband's famous mistress sat just a few feet away. But the cruelty went deeper than the physical affair. It was financial and psychological. Jo portrayed himself as Swanson's wealthy benefactor, showering her with expensive gifts. Years later, Swanson discovered the truth. Jo had not used his own money to buy those gifts. He had secretly charged them to Swanson's own production company accounts. He was a man who took everything and paid for nothing. This pattern of blatant disrespect continued for decades. Even as he aged into his 60s, Jo maintained a 10-year relationship with his 24-year-old secretary, Janet de Rosiers. He did not confine this affair to hotels. De Rosiers traveled with the family. She lived in their homes. Jo allowed his young mistress to sit in the family living room and massage him in plain sight, directly in front of Rose. By this point, the marriage was a physical and emotional wasteland. There was no intimacy. There were no private conversations. They did not even exchange the standard, polite kisses on the cheek when greeting each other. Jo simply treated Rose as the manager of his household and the mother of his children, entirely separate from his personal life. Faced with this constant degradation, Rose had to make a choice. She could scream, fight, and cause a public scandal, or she could build a wall. She chose the wall. Rose developed a terrifyingly blank public mask. When confronted with her husband's mistresses, she acted as if they were invisible. She never raised her voice. She never gave a quote to the press. She treated Gloria Swanson with an icy, flawless politeness that left the actress deeply unnerved. Swanson later admitted she could not figure Rose out, wondering if the Kennedy matriarch was simply a fool, a living saint, or a better actress than anyone in Hollywood. She was none of those things. She was simply trapped. We know she was trapped because the mask did slip. It happened only once, but it revealed the sheer desperation boiling underneath her stoic exterior. In 1920, after 6 years of marriage, Rose's psychological defenses finally broke. Jo's affairs and his long absences were suffocating her. She was 8 months pregnant with their 4th child, Kathleen. The physical exhaustion of pregnancy combined with the emotional isolation became too much to bear. Rose made a desperate move. She packed her bags, left her husband's home, and fled back to her parents' house in Boston. It was a massive risk. In the 1920s, a pregnant woman leaving a wealthy, powerful husband was a social scandal of the highest order. But Rose was entirely out of options. She went back to the only man she thought might protect her, her father, Honey Fitz. She walked into his house, pregnant and defeated, looking for a way out of her marriage. Her father looked at her and shut the door on her only escape route. Honey Fitz was a pragmatic politician and a strict Catholic. He did not offer his daughter a shoulder to cry on. He did not offer to confront Jo. Instead, he reminded her of the brutal reality of their social standing. They were a high-profile Catholic family. In their world, divorce was not a sin. It was a total social and political death sentence. If Rose divorced Jo, she would bring immense shame on the Fitzgerald name. She would be excommunicated from her social circles. He gave her an ultimatum. He told her she had made her bed, and as a Catholic woman, she had to lie in it. He ordered her to pack her bags and go back to her husband. This moment broke Rose completely. When she had been denied her education at Wellesley years earlier, She learned that men controlled her future. Now, standing pregnant in her father's house, being ordered back to an abusive marriage, she learned a much darker lesson. She learned she had absolutely no allies. Her father would not protect her. The church would not protect her. Society would not protect her. She was entirely alone. Rose returned to Joe Kennedy's house. She never tried to leave again. But she did not return as the same woman, since she could not change her reality, and she could not physically escape it. She decided to chemically alter how she experienced it. She began relying heavily on prescription tranquilizers. Her drug of choice was Seconal, a powerful barbiturate used to treat severe insomnia and anxiety. Seconal depresses the central nervous system. It slows down brain activity. It blunts sharp emotions. Rose began taking the pills to sleep, but soon relied on them to simply exist within the household. The medication acted as a chemical shield. It numbed the pain of Joe's affairs. It dissolved the jealousy. It flattened her rage. The pills allowed her to walk through her own home, see her husband with his mistresses, and feel absolutely nothing. She effectively killed her own emotions to survive her marriage. She perfected her posture. She pinned on a permanent smile, and she retreated into a tightly controlled, heavily medicated internal world. She had accepted her life sentence, but the rage and the need for control that she suppressed did not disappear. It had to go somewhere. Since she could no longer control her husband, and she could no longer control her own destiny, she turned her obsessive focus onto the only things in the world she had absolute, unquestioned authority over: her children. Rose Kennedy could not control her husband's infidelity. She could not control the rigid social hierarchy of Boston. She could not control the fact that she was trapped in a marriage devoid of love and respect. But she had 9 children, and in her children she found the one domain where her authority was absolute, unquestioned, and total. She did not raise her children. She managed them. She turned her households in Brookline, Bronxville, and Hyannisport into high-functioning militaristic training camps. The Kennedy home was not a place of warmth, comfort, or maternal affection. It was a factory designed to produce political weapons. To manage 9 children efficiently, Rose eliminated emotion from her parenting entirely. She replaced maternal instinct with clerical administration. She developed a highly rigid, scientific system to track the physical and intellectual development of every child. Joseph Jr., John, Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Edward. The core of this system was a wooden box filled with index cards. Rose treated her children like livestock bred for racing. She maintained a detailed, meticulously updated index card for each child. On these cards, she recorded every physical metric down to the millimeter and the ounce. She logged their height, their weight, their shoe sizes, their dental visits, their vaccinations, and their illnesses. She tracked their eye exams and their posture. This was not done out of a mother's anxious care. It was done to enforce absolute conformity. If a child's index card indicated they had gained slightly more weight than her strict standards allowed, the discipline was immediate and ruthless. Rose would march into the kitchen and order the cook to cut that specific child's food rations. There was no discussion, no sympathy, and no exceptions. If a child was hungry, it did not matter. The metric had to be corrected. The dining room table was the center of this psychological gauntlet. Meals in the Kennedy household were not times for family bonding. They were high-pressure arenas. Rose and Joe required the children to read the New York Times daily. During dinner, the children were grilled on current events, politics, and history. They were not allowed to speak about trivial matters, personal feelings, or childish things. If a child did not have a sharp, articulate opinion on a complex political issue, they were ignored or mocked by their older siblings and their parents. Crying was strictly forbidden. Complaining was completely outlawed. If a child fell, got hurt, or felt sick, they were expected to hide it. Rose famously instituted a rule: Kennedys don't cry. She equated physical and emotional pain with weakness. The result of this clinical high-pressure environment was severe emotional starvation. Despite living in mansions and having access to massive wealth, the Kennedy children grew up entirely deprived of basic human affection. Rose provided them with top-tier education, expensive clothes, and relentless discipline, but she offered zero physical comfort. There were no hugs, no comforting words after a nightmare, and no unconditional support. This emotional famine left deep psychological scars on all of the children. It bred a fierce, almost violent competition among the siblings, as they constantly fought for the scarce resource of their parents' approval. The most devastating testament to Rose's coldness came years later from her second son, John F. Kennedy. JFK spent his entire childhood battling severe chronic health issues. He was constantly hospitalized with gastrointestinal problems, severe allergies, and spinal pain. Yet, his mother viewed his illnesses primarily as logistical inconveniences. She rarely sat by his bedside. She rarely offered a soothing word. Decades later, when JFK was the President of the United States, he sat with a close aide and reflected on his childhood. With a quiet, chilling clarity, the president confessed a brutal truth. In his entire life, he could not recall a single instance where his mother had said the words, "I love you." As the children grew older, Rose distanced herself from them even further. The chaos of 9 children, combined with the underlying misery of her marriage, drove her to seek extreme isolation. She began to physically separate herself from her own family. During family vacations at their massive compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, Rose would frequently abandon the household. She would leave the children with the nannies and staff and go play golf alone. She built a small, isolated cabin on the property, entirely separate from the main house. She called it her retreat. She would lock herself inside for hours, refusing to let anyone in, claiming she needed the time for silent prayer and religious reflection. In reality, she was simply hiding from the life she had built. When she was in the main house, her behavior grew increasingly eccentric. Stripped of control over her husband and her own happiness, she developed severe obsessive-compulsive habits to exert control over her physical environment. She became terrified of aging and obsessed with maintaining a perfect physical facade. She would walk around the house wearing a rigid, terrifying beauty mask, completely ignoring the staff and her children. Her need to control the household environment bordered on manic. She would walk through the rooms of her mansions with a safety pin attached to the front of her expensive dresses. Attached to the safety pin was a blank piece of white paper and a pencil. She would patrol the house, scanning for the most microscopic errors. If a maid had left a magazine slightly askew on a table, Rose wrote it down. If a throw pillow was not perfectly fluffed, she wrote it down. If a window shade was pulled down an inch lower than the others, she wrote it down. She did not fix these things herself. She compiled these lists and used them to berate the domestic staff at the end of the day. She treated her home like a sterile hospital ward, and she was the head nurse searching for an excuse to punish her subordinates. This behavior revealed a bizarre and deep-seated contradiction in Rose's personality, particularly regarding money and status. Rose was highly devoted to the Catholic Church. She attended daily mass and donated heavily to religious causes. Because of the Kennedy family's immense financial contributions, Pope Pius XII granted Rose the highly exclusive title of Papal Countess. She was the 6th American woman to ever receive this honor. She took the title incredibly seriously. To ensure she looked the part of a countess, she spared absolutely no expense on herself. She flew to Paris to attend exclusive fashion shows. She spent thousands of dollars buying custom haute couture from designers like Christian Dior and Givenchy. She demanded to be treated like European royalty. Yet, the woman who would drop a small fortune on a single dress in Paris was astonishingly, ruthlessly cheap when dealing with people who had less power than she did. She audited her household ledgers with an iron fist. If a maid or a gardener accidentally miscalculated their hours by 15 minutes, The papal countess would demand they pay the money back. She monitored the grocery bills obsessively. In one infamous incident, she sent her personal secretary to France to run errands and manage logistics for a family trip. When the secretary submitted the expense report, Rose scrutinized every single receipt. She noticed a charge for basic toiletries. The woman who just bought Parisian haute couture threw a massive fit, screaming at her secretary and accusing her of buying too many tissues and toilet paper. This contradiction defined Rose Kennedy. She was willing to pay any price to project an image of flawless grandeur to the outside world. But behind closed doors, her world was small, petty, calculating, and entirely devoid of empathy. She had built a machine. She had successfully programmed her children to be aggressive, highly educated, and ambitious. But she failed to recognize that a machine built without empathy has no safety brakes. Her clinical demand for perfection left absolutely no room for weakness, failure, or imperfection. And this fatal flaw in her system was about to collide with a devastating reality. Her third child, Rosemary, was not perfect. She was deeply, tragically flawed. And in the Kennedy household, imperfection was not something to be nurtured. It was something to be erased. The Kennedy machine, engineered by Rose and funded by Joe, was built on a singular, uncompromising principle: absolute perfection. The children were expected to be smarter, faster, and more charismatic than anyone else in the room. They were bred to conquer. The system was designed to handle high achievers. It had no safety nets, no contingencies for weakness, and no room for error. But biology does not care about political ambition. In 1918, the Kennedy demand for perfection collided with a devastating medical reality. The result was the darkest, most closely guarded, and most unforgivable chapter in the family's history. This is the tragedy of the third Kennedy child, Rosemary. The tragedy began before Rosemary even took her first breath. In September 1918, Rose went into labor at her home in Brookline, Massachusetts. It was the height of the deadly Spanish influenza pandemic. The medical system in Boston was completely overwhelmed. Doctors were scarce, exhausted, and overworked. When Rose's contractions escalated, the attending nurse panicked. The doctor had not yet arrived. Instead of letting nature take its course and delivering the child herself, the nurse made a catastrophic, medically indefensible decision. She ordered Rose to keep her legs squeezed tightly shut. When the baby's head began to emerge, the nurse physically used her hands to push the baby back up into the birth canal. She held the baby inside for 2 grueling hours, waiting for the doctor to walk through the door. During those 2 hours, the baby was starved of oxygen. When Rosemary Kennedy was finally born, the physical damage to her brain was already done, and it was permanent. As Rosemary grew from an infant to a toddler, it became undeniably clear that she was not developing at the same pace as her older brothers, Joe Jr. and John. She was slow to crawl, she was slow to walk, she had difficulty feeding herself. As she reached school age, her intellectual development stalled. Medical professionals today would classify her as having a mild to moderate intellectual disability. Her mental capacity eventually plateaued at the level of a 3rd grader. In a normal family, a child with developmental delays would require patience, specialized care, and unconditional support. But the Kennedy family was not normal. To Rose and Joe, Rosemary's disability was not a tragedy to be managed with compassion. It was a threat. It was a glaring, unacceptable defect in their otherwise flawless genetic brand. Furthermore, in the early 20th century, the Catholic Church and high society harbored deep, cruel stigmas regarding mental disabilities. It was often whispered that a defective child was a punishment from God for the sins of the parents, or a sign of bad blood. For a family like the Kennedys, who were desperately fighting for the respect of the Boston establishment, acknowledging a disabled child was unthinkable. So, Rose made a decision. She decided to simply deny the reality of her daughter's condition. Rose applied the exact same rigid, militant standards to Rosemary that she applied to her gifted sons. She refused to lower her expectations. Rosemary's index cards were kept just like the others. She was forced to participate in the hyper-competitive family sailing races and the aggressive touch football games, despite lacking the physical coordination to keep up. Most cruelly, Rose forced Rosemary into rigorous academic tutoring. Even though the girl could barely comprehend basic math, she was subjected to strict lessons in Latin and advanced literature. Rose believed that with enough discipline and sheer willpower, she could force her daughter's brain to function normally. When it didn't work, Rose became frustrated. Rosemary grew up constantly surrounded by siblings who were exceptionally bright, fast-talking, and highly competitive. She knew she was different. She knew she could not please her parents the way her brothers did. She was trapped in an environment that constantly highlighted her inadequacies, yet she was desperate for her mother's approval. To hide her from the public eye, Rose and Joe bounced Rosemary from one specialized, remote boarding school to another. They strictly managed her public appearances. The absolute peak of this facade occurred in 1938. Joe Kennedy had been appointed the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom. It was the ultimate victory over the Boston Brahmins. An Irish Catholic was now representing America to the King of England. As part of the diplomatic customs, the Kennedy daughters were presented to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace. It was a highly choreographed, high-stakes social event. Rose spent months drilling Rosemary on the complex curtsy required for the king. On the day of the presentation, as Rosemary approached the king, her lack of coordination betrayed her. She stumbled. She nearly fell completely flat on the floor in front of the British monarchy. It was exactly the kind of public imperfection Rose dreaded. But Rose's reaction was chillingly robotic. She did not rush to help her daughter. She did not express sympathy. She simply pretended it didn't happen. The next day, Rose briefed the international press, declaring the event an absolute, flawless triumph. The stumble was erased from the official family narrative. But as Rosemary entered her late teens and early 20s, she could no longer be easily managed. Her physical body had matured into that of a highly attractive young woman, but she still possessed the emotional maturity of a child. She grew increasingly frustrated with the strict rules her mother imposed. Her mood swings became severe and unpredictable. She began throwing violent tantrums. Most terrifying to Joe Sr., Rosemary began sneaking out of her convent schools at night. She would wander into local towns and frequent taverns, seeking attention from men. For Joe Kennedy, this was an absolute nightmare. He was already plotting the political dynasty of his sons. He viewed Rosemary as a ticking time bomb. If she were to become pregnant out of wedlock or get caught up in a sordid public scandal, the press would destroy the family. The political futures of Joe Jr. and John would be instantly annihilated. Joe Sr. decided that Rosemary had to be neutralized. In the fall of 1941, when Rosemary was 23 years old, Joe sought out Dr. Walter Freeman, a neurologist aggressively championing a radical new psychiatric procedure, the prefrontal lobotomy. The surgery involved drilling holes into the patient's skull and using a surgical instrument to blindly slice through the connective tissue in the brain's prefrontal cortex. It was an experimental, highly controversial procedure, usually reserved for the most violent, unmanageable asylum patients. Rosemary was not violently insane. She was simply learning disabled and frustrated. But Joe did not care about medical ethics. He cared about risk management. Without telling his children, and according to historical records, without consulting Rose, Joe scheduled the surgery for November 1941. The procedure was barbaric. Rosemary was not put under general anesthesia. She was given a mild tranquilizer and a local anesthetic to numb her scalp. She was awake. As the surgeons drilled into her skull and began slicing into her brain tissue, they asked Rosemary to sing songs and recite the Lord's Prayer. They used her voice to gauge how deep to cut. They kept slicing and scraping until she became incoherent, and then, eventually completely silent, The surgery was a catastrophic failure. Joe Kennedy had intended to make his daughter docile. Instead, he completely destroyed her. When Rosemary woke up, her capacity to speak was gone. Her ability to walk was gone. She was left incontinent, partially paralyzed, and her mental capacity was reduced to that of an infant. She would stare blankly at the walls, unable to communicate her own pain. Faced with the monstrous result of his own actions, Joe Kennedy did what he always did when something broke. He hid it, and he threw money at it. He immediately shipped his ruined daughter to a private psychiatric facility in upstate New York, and a few years later moved her permanently to St. Coletta, an isolated Catholic institution in Wisconsin. What followed was not just a cover-up, it was a total erasure. Joe Kennedy returned home and told his other children that Rosemary had moved away to work as a teacher at a specialized school. The siblings were forbidden from asking further questions. They had absolutely no idea what their father had done to their sister. But the most unforgivable aspect of this tragedy does not belong to Joe. It belongs to Rose. Whether Rose knew about the lobotomy before it happened is a matter of historical debate. But what she did afterward is a matter of factual record. When she discovered that her daughter's brain had been surgically butchered and that she had been banished to an institution, Rose did not rebel. She did not leave her husband. She did not demand to see her child. Instead, she chose the myth of Camelot over the life of her daughter. She became completely complicit in the erasure of Rosemary Kennedy. For 20 straight years, Rose Kennedy never once went to Wisconsin to visit her daughter. She never wrote her a letter. She completely excised Rosemary from the family's daily life. She took the deception to the press. For decades, whenever reporters asked about the missing Kennedy sister, Rose would smile her flawless, frozen smile and lie smoothly. She claimed Rosemary was reclusive, shy, and dedicating her life to teaching disabled children. In her own memoirs, written years later, Rose continued the lie. Attributing Rosemary's condition to a vague accident, she allowed her other children to grow up, enter politics, and become global icons, all while completely ignorant of the fact that their sister was locked away in a facility, staring at a wall. It wasn't until 1961, when Joe Kennedy suffered a massive, debilitating stroke that robbed him of his speech, that the truth finally came to light. With Joe incapacitated, the Kennedy siblings finally discovered the location of their sister. When they traveled to St. Coletta and saw what had been done to her, they were horrified. This discovery would eventually drive Eunice Kennedy to found the Special Olympics, a monumental achievement for the disabled community born directly out of the guilt and trauma of what was done to her sister. But for Rose, there was no redemption. She had stood by and watched her husband destroy their child to protect a political brand, and then she helped him bury the evidence. She proved that her maternal instincts were entirely conditional. If a child could advance the family's power, they were pushed relentlessly. If a child threatened that power, they were discarded without a second thought. The lobotomy of Rosemary Kennedy was the ultimate proof of the matriarch's coldness. The machine Rose built was working perfectly, and the body count was just beginning. Psychology provides a very clear, grim blueprint for how abuse functions within closed systems. Victims who are stripped of their power often survive by identifying with their abusers. They internalize the very rules that destroyed them, and once they achieve a position of authority, they enforce those exact same rules on the next generation. Rose Kennedy survived her husband's blatant infidelity and psychological cruelty by shutting down her own emotions. She built a fortress of denial and rigid Catholic duty. But as her sons grew up and began bringing wives into the family, Rose did not act as a protector to these young women. She became their warden. She transformed into the ultimate toxic matriarch. Her expectation was simple and ruthless. The women who married into the Kennedy family had to endure exactly what she had endured. They were required to swallow their pride, ignore the betrayals, and maintain the dynasty's flawless public facade. Rose enforced a culture of silent complicity, turning the Kennedy household into a meat grinder for the women unfortunate enough to enter it. No one understood this better than Jacqueline Bouvier. When Jackie married John F. Kennedy in 1953, the press framed it as an American fairy tale. The reality was a nightmare that perfectly mirrored Rose's own marriage. JFK had completely absorbed his father's predatory appetite. He viewed infidelity not as a moral failing, but as a biological entitlement. He pursued women relentlessly, engaging in affairs with secretaries, actresses, and socialites. He did this recklessly, bringing severe consequences into his marital bed. According to multiple historical biographers, JFK's rampant infidelity resulted in him contracting and transmitting sexually transmitted diseases to Jackie. Medical historians have pointed to these infections as a direct contributing factor to Jackie's devastating struggles with fertility, leading to her repeated miscarriages and premature births. The breaking point for Jackie occurred in 1956. She was highly pregnant and suddenly experienced severe complications. She was rushed to the hospital and delivered a stillborn daughter, whom she intended to name Arabella. It was a moment of profound physical and emotional trauma. But Jackie woke up in the hospital completely alone. JFK was not at the hospital. He was not even in the country. He was cruising the Mediterranean on a luxury yacht with a group of friends and a roster of young women. When he was finally contacted and told that his wife had delivered a dead child, he initially refused to cut his vacation short. He only returned to the United States when a political advisor explicitly warned him that abandoning his grieving wife would destroy his chances of running for national office. Jackie was utterly devastated and furious. She had reached her absolute limit. She wanted a divorce. The Kennedy machine immediately sprang into action to crush her rebellion. The family could not afford a divorced candidate. First came the money. Joseph Sr. approached Jackie and offered her a staggering sum, a reported $1 million, deposited directly into a trust fund, simply to stay in the marriage and keep her mouth shut. Then came Rose. Instead of offering her daughter-in-law maternal comfort or confronting her son about his monstrous behavior, Rose applied immense psychological pressure. She sat Jackie down and delivered the Kennedy philosophy. Rose told her that great men have great flaws and that it was the duty of a political wife to suffer well. Rose demanded that Jackie put on her makeup, paste on a smile, and stand by John for the sake of his career and the family's image. Rose was demanding that Jackie perform the exact same emotional suicide that she had performed decades earlier. Jackie took the money and she stayed, but she developed a deep, permanent resentment toward her mother-in-law. She saw right through Rose's pious exterior. Jackie recognized that Rose's extreme religious devotion was simply a shield to avoid dealing with reality. In a private letter, Jackie delivered a brutally sharp assessment of the matriarch, writing that Rose was a shallow, emotionally vacant woman who would rather say her rosary than read a book. But Jackie had the intellectual armor and the public popularity to survive the Kennedy machine. The women who followed her were not as fortunate. The generational trauma Rose helped enforce actively crushed them. Take Joan Bennett, who married the youngest Kennedy son, Ted, in 1958. Joan was soft-spoken, sensitive, and deeply vulnerable. She was completely unequipped for the brutal, high-stakes combat of the Kennedy household. Ted Kennedy was arguably the most reckless of the brothers regarding his personal behavior. His heavy drinking and blatant philandering were open secrets in Washington. The media, charmed by the Kennedy mystique, actively covered up for him. But inside the marriage, Joan was drowning. She turned to Rose for help. She received nothing but cold dismissal. Rose expected Joan to act like a Kennedy woman, to ignore the affairs, to campaign vigorously, and to look perfect in the photographs. When Joan cracked under the pressure, the family did not help her. They discarded her. Joan developed a severe battle with alcoholism and clinical depression. Instead of receiving empathy, she was thrown to the wolves. The family closed ranks around Ted, protecting his political career, while Joan was publicly humiliated, mocked by the press for her disheveled appearances, and treated as an embarrassment by her own in-laws. The family that demanded perfection had no tolerance for the victims their perfection demanded. This toxic legacy, the absolute protection of the Kennedy men and the systematic destruction of their wives, did not end with Rose's children. It was a poison that seeped into the grandchildren's generation with lethal results. The most horrifying modern extension of this blueprint was the fate of Mary Richardson Kennedy, who married Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., the son of Bobby Kennedy. When their marriage collapsed, Mary was subjected to extreme financial and psychological warfare. The family machinery worked to isolate her entirely. During their bitter divorce proceedings, RFK Jr. allegedly subjected her to severe emotional abuse, culminating in a devastating final blow. According to close friends, he explicitly told the mother of his 4 children that she would be better off dead. Completely broken by the isolation and the abuse, Mary Richardson Kennedy walked into the barn behind her home in 2012 and hanged herself. She became the ultimate tragic collateral damage of a generational culture of isolation and psychological warfare that had roots stretching back to the Matriarch's era. But Rose's cruelty was not just reserved for the women who married into the family. When it came to protecting her rigid worldview and the family's image, Rose was perfectly capable of demonstrating absolute cold-bloodedness toward her own biological children. This was the fate of Kathleen Kennedy, known to the family as Kik. Kik was the 4th Kennedy child. She was vivacious, rebellious, and fiercely independent. She possessed the charm of her brothers, but she chafed under her mother's suffocating religious rules. During Joe Sr.'s time as ambassador to the UK, Kik fell deeply in love with a British aristocrat named William Cavendish, the Marquess of Hartington. There was only one problem. Cavendish was a Protestant, specifically a high-ranking member of the Church of England. In the 1940s, for a prominent Irish Catholic family like the Kennedys, marrying a Protestant was not just frowned upon. It was considered a severe religious betrayal. The Catholic Church required the Protestant spouse to agree to raise all children in the Catholic faith. Cavendish, as a future duke whose family was heavily tied to the Church of England, legally and traditionally could not agree to this. Kik decided to marry him anyway in a civil ceremony in 1944. Rose Kennedy's reaction was explosive, absolute, and devoid of any maternal love. She did not care that her daughter had found happiness. She cared about the optics. She cared about the reaction of the Catholic bishops in Boston. She cared about the family brand. Rose completely excommunicated her own daughter. She refused to attend the wedding. She forbade Joe Sr. from attending. She ordered every single one of Kik's siblings to boycott the ceremony, threatening them with severe consequences if they supported their sister. Kik walked down the aisle with her eldest brother, Joe Jr., being the only family member brave enough to defy their mother and attend. Rose cut Kik out of her life. She stopped communicating with her. She wrote letters to friends stating she was heartbroken, not because she missed her daughter, but because her daughter had lost her soul. Tragedy struck almost immediately. Just 4 months after the wedding, William Cavendish was killed in combat during World War II. Kik was left a young, grieving widow. Even then, Rose's sympathy was scarce and conditional. 4 years later, in 1948, Kik found love again. She began a relationship with Peter Fitzwilliam, another wealthy British Protestant who was scandalously in the process of getting a divorce. They planned to marry. Before the scandal could fully break in the press, Kik and Peter boarded a small private plane to fly to the French Riviera. They flew into a severe, violent storm. The plane was torn apart in the turbulence and crashed into the side of a mountain in France. Everyone on board was killed instantly. Kik was 28 years old. When the news of her daughter's violent death reached Rose Kennedy, her reaction cemented her legacy of absolute ice. She did not fly to Europe to claim her daughter's body. She did not organize a family mourning period. Instead, Rose Kennedy flatly refused to attend her own daughter's funeral. Joe Sr. traveled to England alone to bury his child. The Cavendish family arranged the funeral, burying Kick in their family estate in Derbyshire. The headstone read Kathleen Cavendish, Marchioness of Hartington. The only Kennedy present was her father. Back in America, Rose justified her absence to the press and her friends by claiming she was too distraught, choosing to stay in a hospital in Boston for routine tests. But the reality was obvious to everyone inside the inner circle. Rose Kennedy could not forgive her daughter for defying the Catholic Church. Even in death, the image, the rules, and the rigid discipline mattered more than the flesh and blood she had brought into the world. She had successfully purged the imperfection from her family, forcing the wives into silence and abandoning the daughter who refused to comply. The dynasty's pristine facade remained untouchable, but the Kennedy arrogance, the belief that they were untouchable, was about to trigger a chain reaction of violence that not even Rose could control. The American media has spent decades selling a supernatural narrative to the public, the Kennedy curse. It is a story of a glamorous, golden family stalked by a tragic, inescapable dark cloud. It makes for excellent television. It evokes sympathy. It frames the family as victims of a cruel, invisible destiny. But historical facts do not support curses. When you strip away the myth and examine the timeline, the truth is far less romantic and much more damning. There was no curse. The tragedies that decimated the Kennedy family were the direct, mathematical result of staggering hubris. They were the consequences of a family engineered by Joe and Rose Kennedy to believe that the laws of physics, the rules of society, and the boundaries of basic human safety simply did not apply to them. They were bred to be reckless. They were taught that winning was the only metric of value, and that any mess they made could be cleaned up with enough money and political leverage. The first fatal consequence of this engineering occurred in August 1944. The original plan for the Kennedy dynasty did not involve John F. Kennedy. The entire weight of the family's political ambition rested squarely on the shoulders of the eldest son, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. He was the golden child, athletic, aggressive, and groomed from birth to become the first Catholic president of the United States. But during World War II, a dangerous sibling rivalry escalated. John F. Kennedy, the sickly second son, had become a national war hero after his PT-109 boat was sunk in the Pacific. Joe Jr. was furious. He could not stand being eclipsed by his younger brother. Driven by the family's hyper-competitive ethos, Joe Jr. volunteered for Operation Aphrodite, a highly experimental, practically suicidal bombing mission over Europe. The mission required flying an aircraft packed with 170 pounds of high explosives, arming it in mid-air, and then parachuting out before it crashed into a Nazi bunker. It was a reckless, unnecessary risk driven purely by ego. On August 12, 1944, the explosives detonated prematurely over England. Joe Jr. was vaporized instantly. In a normal family, the loss of the eldest son in a fiery explosion would warrant a period of profound mourning. The parents might reconsider the intense pressure they had placed on their children. Rose and Joe Sr. did not. The grief was real, but the machine could not stop. The presidency had been paid for in blood, and they intended to collect it. Before the dust had even settled, the parents simply shifted the crushing weight of their ambition onto the next son in line. John F. Kennedy, who had little interest in a grueling political career and preferred a quiet life as a writer, was drafted into the family business. He was told unequivocally that he was taking his brother's place. Joe Sr. supplied the millions required to fund the campaigns. But Joe Sr. was also a massive political liability. He was widely disliked, known for his appeasement of Hitler prior to the war, and viewed as a ruthless bootlegger and Wall Street manipulator. He had to operate in the shadows. Rose, however, was the ultimate public weapon. As JFK ran for Congress in 1946 and eventually for the presidency in 1960, Rose stepped into the spotlight and proved she was a far more lethal political operative than her husband. She pioneered a completely new form of political campaigning, the Kennedy Teas. These were not casual social gatherings. They were highly organized, heavily funded, and strategically brilliant political theater. Rose would host massive tea parties at elite hotels across Massachusetts and later across the country. She invited thousands of women, working-class mothers, Catholic nuns, society wives. Rose knew exactly how to manipulate her image for maximum impact. When speaking to wealthy donors, she wore her Parisian haute couture and spoke with the clipped, refined accent of the Boston elite, projecting undeniable authority. But when addressing working-class Catholic women, she would swap the mink coat for a simple dress, put on a humble babushka headscarf, and speak passionately about the struggles of raising a large family. She was a chameleon. She hypnotized the female voting bloc, leveraging her status as a papal countess and a mother of a war hero to grant her son an aura of untouchable moral authority. When JFK won the presidency in 1960, it was the ultimate vindication for Rose. She had beaten the Boston Brahmins. She had conquered Washington. Her son was the most powerful man on earth. But the arrogance that got them to the White House was the same arrogance that would destroy them. The assassinations of JFK in 1963 and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 are permanent scars on the American psyche. But within the context of the family's history, they were the culmination of high-stakes, ruthless political gamesmanship. The Kennedys played dirty. They made powerful, dangerous enemies. From aggressive crackdowns on organized crime, which Joe Sr. had previously courted, to reckless covert operations in Cuba, the Kennedy brothers operated with a dangerous sense of invulnerability. They believed they could outsmart, outspend, or outmaneuver anyone. They were wrong. When the bullets shattered the illusion of Camelot, Rose's reaction was terrifying in its stoicism. She refused to crumble. When JFK was murdered in Dallas, the nation wept. Rose put on a black veil, stood perfectly straight, and offered a chilling declaration of her own ego. "No one is going to feel sorry for me," she stated. Her priority was not public grieving. It was maintaining the myth of invincibility. During Bobby Kennedy's aggressive, highly controversial run for the presidency in 1968, reporters questioned the massive, opaque, and arguably unethical flood of money financing his campaign. Rose did not bother with political spin. She snapped back with raw, aristocratic entitlement. "It's our money, and we can spend it any way we want." Bobby was gunned down in a Los Angeles kitchen shortly after. By the end of the 1960s, the two brightest stars of the dynasty were dead. The responsibility fell to the youngest, least capable, and most reckless brother, Ted Kennedy. And it was through Ted that the family's profound moral rot and their utter disregard for human life was fully exposed to the world. It happened in July 1969. In an incident known as the Chappaquiddick Scandal, Ted Kennedy was attending a party on Chappaquiddick Island, off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. He was heavily intoxicated. Late in the evening, he got into his Oldsmobile sedan with a 28-year-old campaign worker named Mary Jo Kopechne. Ted drove the car recklessly down an unlit dirt road and drove it straight off a narrow wooden bridge into a dark tidal pond. The car flipped upside down and sank into the murky water. What happened next is a masterclass in cowardice and toxic privilege. Ted Kennedy managed to kick out a window and swim to the surface. He survived. Mary Jo Kopechne did not. She was trapped in the back seat of the submerged car. Ted did not run to the nearest house to call the police. He did not call the fire department. He did not scream for help. Instead, he walked back to his hotel. He changed his clothes. He took a shower. He went to sleep. The next morning, he complained to the hotel manager about the noise in the lobby. He chatted with friends. He waited a full 10 hours before finally reporting the accident to the authorities. By the time divers reached the car, Mary Jo was dead. But the autopsy and the diver's testimony revealed a horrifying detail. She had not drowned immediately. She had found a pocket of air in the overturned car. She had survived for hours in the freezing, pitch-black water, slowly running out of oxygen, waiting for a rescue that Ted Kennedy never called for. She suffocated to death. If a normal citizen had committed this act, they would have been charged with vehicular manslaughter and sent to prison for decades. But Ted was a Kennedy. The family's crisis management machine, built by Joe and sustained by Rose, kicked into high gear. They deployed millions of dollars. They hired the best fixers and lawyers in the country. They intimidated witnesses. They secured a secret, closed-door hearing. They manipulated the local police. The strategy was clear. Mary Jo Kopechne was collateral damage. She was an expendable woman. The only thing that mattered was protecting the Kennedy brand and saving Ted's political career. It worked. Ted Kennedy pleaded guilty to a minor charge of leaving the scene of an accident. He received a 2-month suspended sentence. He served 0 days in jail. He returned to the United States Senate and served for another 40 years. Chappaquiddick proved that the rules Rose and Joe had established were absolute. The Kennedy men were untouchable, and the women in their orbit were entirely disposable. The cover-up saved Ted from prison, but it permanently destroyed his chances of ever reaching the White House. The public could stomach political ruthlessness, but they could not stomach a man who left a woman to suffocate in a submerged car while he slept in a hotel. But the inherited recklessness did not stop with Ted. It skipped a generation and proved fatal once again in 1999. John F. Kennedy Jr. was American royalty. He was handsome, wealthy, and universally beloved. But he had inherited the family's fatal flaw, the arrogant belief that the rules did not apply to him. In July 1999, JFK Jr. was scheduled to fly his private Piper Saratoga aircraft to a family wedding. He was an inexperienced pilot. He was not rated to fly using instruments alone, meaning he relied entirely on his visual sight out the window. On the evening of the flight, a heavy, thick haze rolled over the Atlantic coast, completely obscuring the horizon. Every experienced pilot on the airfield grounded their planes. They warned JFK Jr. that flying into the pea soup without instrument training was a death sentence. JFK Jr. ignored the experts. He was a Kennedy. He believed he could push through. He loaded his wife, Carolyn Bessette, and her sister, Lauren, into the plane and took off into the dark haze. Miles over the ocean, surrounded by total blackness, he became spatially disoriented. He lost control of the aircraft and drove it into the Atlantic Ocean at high speed, killing all 3 of them instantly. Once again, a Kennedy man's recklessness had destroyed the women beside him. But the most revealing moment happened after the crash. As the nation mourned the loss of America's prince, the Kennedy PR machine went to work one last time. They could not allow John Jr. to be remembered as a foolish, arrogant pilot who killed his wife and sister-in-law. They needed a scapegoat. They leaked stories to the press, ruthlessly blaming Carolyn. They painted her as a difficult, demanding, red-headed diva. They claimed she had taken too long to get a pedicure, delaying the flight until after dark, effectively blaming the dead woman for her husband's fatal lack of judgment. It was a vicious, post-mortem character assassination. The cycle was complete. From Joe Sr. destroying his daughter Rosemary, to John infecting his wife, to Ted abandoning Mary Jo, to the smearing of Carolyn Bessette, the family playbook never changed. The machine Rose Kennedy built was designed to produce conquerors. It succeeded, but it was a machine devoid of brakes, lacking any moral compass beyond self-preservation. They chased power with a blinding intensity, and in the end, that thirst for power left a trail of crushed women and early graves in its wake. There was no curse. There was only the inevitable result of a family that thought they were gods, operating in a world that requires men to be human. Rose Kennedy always possessed a supreme, unshakable belief that she was specially chosen by God. She believed her wealth, her status, and her family's meteoric rise were tangible proof of divine favor. But if you look at the final decades of her life, it becomes difficult to see her longevity as a blessing. Under the cold light of psychological analysis, living to the age of 104 did not look like a reward. It looked like a life sentence. It looked like the ultimate psychological punishment. The human mind is not built to withstand the sheer volume of unnatural tragedy that Rose Kennedy was forced to process. To live past a century meant she had to sit in the front row and watch the empire she built meticulously tear itself apart. She had to use her iron will to watch the children she bore be cut down by assassins' bullets, vaporized in plane crashes, or institutionalized and lobotomized. Out of the 9 children she raised with ruthless precision, only 4 were still breathing by the time she reached her final years. But the punishment of her extreme old age was not just emotional, it was physical. For a woman who had spent her entire existence obsessively maintaining control over her image, control over her children's diets, control over the exact placement of magazines in her living room, the end of her life stripped her of every ounce of agency. In the 1980s, the matriarch's physical fortress began to crumble. She suffered a series of devastating strokes, 5 in total. The damage to her central nervous system was catastrophic. By 1984, the woman who used to walk the halls of her mansions, pinning notes to her dresses, to scold the maids, could no longer walk at all. She was permanently confined to a wheelchair. Her sharp, calculating mind began to betray her. She lost her ability to speak clearly. She lost her ability to manage the household ledgers. She, who had once demanded that her daughters-in-law suffer in silence and project perfection, was now entirely dependent on a rotating staff of private nurses, 24 hours a day, just to eat, bathe, and survive. The Hyannisport compound, which had once been the roaring epicenter of American political power, a place filled with senators, movie stars, aggressive touch football games, and relentless ambition, was transformed into a silent, heavily guarded nursing home. The sprawling lawns were empty. The house was quiet. Rose Kennedy spent her final years sitting in a chair, staring out at the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by the ghosts of a dynasty that had consumed its own children. When you examine a tragedy of this magnitude, the most pressing psychological question is simple. How did she survive it? How does a mother bury that many children and not lose her mind? The answer lies in the ultimate defense mechanism. Rose Kennedy survived the carnage of her own family by constructing a theology of total denial. In her later years, Rose summarized her life experience by frequently quoting the phrase, "the agony and the ecstasy." On the surface, this sounds like the profound acceptance of a deeply religious woman. But psychologists and biographers point to a much darker reality. This phrase was not a statement of humble faith. It was a tool of extreme rationalization. Rose used her rigid Catholic dogma as a shield to deflect any and all personal accountability. She convinced herself that the immense suffering her family endured was simply the divine tax God extracted in exchange for their greatness. By framing the Kennedy tragedies as an act of divine destiny, she effectively neutralized human responsibility. This was a highly strategic mental maneuver. If God was responsible for the assassinations, the plane crashes, and the scandals, then Rose and Joe were not. Her rigid religious worldview allowed her to completely avoid looking in the mirror. She never had to acknowledge that the toxic patriarchal system she enforced was the root cause of the destruction. She never had to admit that raising her sons to believe they were above the law directly led to the reckless behavior that killed them. She never had to face the reality that her emotional starvation of her children created deeply fractured adults who self-medicated with alcohol, dangerous women, and adrenaline. By categorizing every mistake, every crime, and every death as God's will, Rose Kennedy insulated herself from the one emotion that should have broken her: guilt. This absolute self-delusion suffocated any genuine remorse. It allowed her to maintain a serene, pious conscience even when facing the reality of what her husband did to their daughter, Rosemary. It allowed her to sleep at night after she abandoned her daughter, kick in death. It allowed her to look at the broken, addicted, and suicidal wives of her sons and feel absolutely nothing but contempt. She genuinely believed her own myth. She believed the Kennedys were martyrs for America rather than victims of their own monumental hubris. On January 22, 1995, at the age of 104, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy finally died from complications of pneumonia. Her funeral was a massive national event, broadcast across the country. Politicians, celebrities, and the remaining family members gathered to eulogize her as a saint, a patriot, and the ultimate symbol of American resilience. But history requires us to look past the eulogies and examine the ledger. When you strip away the glamour, the wealth, and the manufactured mythology of Camelot, the final verdict on Rose Kennedy is profoundly chilling. The media spent decades painting her as a mother of martyrs who gave her sons to the nation. The objective truth is that she was the chief architect of a family machine that operated on manipulation, emotional repression, and casual cruelty. Rose Kennedy built a dynasty, but she built it on a foundation of crushed individuals. To maintain the illusion of a perfect Catholic family, she became completely complicit in the surgical destruction and erasure of her own disabled daughter. To protect the political viability of the Kennedy men, she forced the women who married them to swallow their dignity, endure relentless public humiliation, and tolerate severe psychological abuse. The supreme power of the Kennedy family was not just built on Joe Sr.'s millions or JFK's undeniable charisma. It was mortared with the silent suffering, the suppressed rage, and the enforced sacrifices of marginalized, expendable women. Rose Kennedy survived everyone. She beat the Boston Brahmins. She put a son in the White House. She achieved the absolute power she craved as a young girl, standing ignored in the Oval Office. But the price of that power was the humanity of her own family. She proved that you can conquer the world. But if you build your empire without a shred of empathy, the empire will eventually eat itself. The myth of Camelot is a story of American royalty. But the reality of Rose Kennedy is a dark, indelible stain on American political history, a brutal reminder that behind every flawless public image, there is often a private, unforgivable cost.